I just want to be talking about some of the examples and how we look at growing our portfolio, iterating on those successful kind of metagame structures that we find to replicate that or repeat that and kind of double down on that success. So I won't be talking about how you make a successful game more successful within itself through updates or live ops, but actually how you create new versions of games to kind of grow your success more rapidly. So to start off, we're a developer and publisher that's based in Wellington, New Zealand. As Alan mentioned, we're coming up to our 20-year anniversary, so we have been at this for a long time, and I'm starting to feel very old in this industry, but that happens. We've got a great team down there of about 85 people, mostly focused on mobile, but we also do a bit of PC and a little bit of VR and console work starting to creep in as well. Over the years, we've made a number of different games. I think right now we have about 30 different games across the App Store and Google Play. Have made various other games for other platforms as well. But I wanted to kind of talk about where we started in mobile and how we sort of grew our portfolio initially. When we were moving from console development, which is where the company was sort of founded and how we evolved and grew to start with, when we got into mobile gaming and wanted to really push forward our own IP and build our publishing strategy, we weren't really sure where to start. So where we did end up starting is somewhere where we already had a little bit of an expertise. We'd already made a lot of sports games for console, from PlayStation 2, PlayStation 3, Xbox, specifically rugby games, rugby league games, horse racing games, things like that. So back in 2009, when we started the PikPok brand, we thought, well, let's start with something that we know. Let's start with something that we already have a bit of a fan base for, that we already have some experience with, and we created the game on the left here, Flick Kick Rugby. Flick Kick Rugby, back in the day when you could create an iPhone game in about 3 weeks with a team of 2 or 3 people, launched, and it was doing okay. And I think for one of our first releases on mobile, we were pretty happy with what we were starting to see there. And we then quickly realized, as we were creating updates to this game, that there was a way that we could get another game out there, as if we just took this rugby game and kind of reskinned it into an Aussie rules game. So that took actually only a couple of days with a couple of people, and suddenly we had 2 games on the App Store. And both of those were doing well. By January of 2010, we were thinking, what other sports can we take this mechanic to? We looked at American football, and at the time the US was the biggest market. It still is one of the biggest markets. So we reskinned Flick Kick Rugby into Flick Kick Field Goal, and that did even better, and we saw an even bigger opportunity there. From there we thought, well, let's take this formula, let's take this mechanic and go even bigger. You know, what's the next biggest sport that we can find? And that was soccer. And that was really our very first hit. What came out of that was Flick Kick Football. And the first release of that in June of 2010, we earned about $200,000 US, and that was really the catalyst that got the whole studio behind mobile development, and everything took off from there. And those games actually formed the foundation of even more games, and the game right on the end there is a game we released in, I think it was the end of 2013, Flick Kick Football Legends, so 4 years later, and that took that idea and built a new metagame around it, and that did the revenue in its first year of what all these other games had done leading up to that point over the previous 4 years. So that was really, that journey that we've had through these titles was really got us thinking about creating a game and then finding opportunities to create new versions of the app in different ways, to find different audiences and to really double down on that success. So one of the things that we know as game developers is that making new games from scratch every time is hard. If you are having to learn about mechanics, if you're having to learn about new technology, develop a new gameplay style or a new art style or find a new audience every time, that's really hard. And that's really risky too, because every time you put a game out there that is completely fresh to your understanding and experience, you're taking some pretty big risks. So it can be quite dangerous to sort of bounce from one game to another without taking some of that learning and experience across. So therefore, a lot of what we do is kind of double down on that existing success so that we can create more predictable and more immediate opportunities in the same way that we did for Flick Kick Rugby, going into those different versions of the game. When we do that, that means that we can leverage all sorts of things. We can leverage existing technology and code, existing tools. We can cross-promote from the existing fan base into the new games. And we can reduce having to develop completely new game designs, because we can kind of leverage some of that creative effort that we've already done. One of the things then that's actually rolled back into our process when we go to greenlight games then is when we do create a new game from scratch in terms of a prototype or a concept, we actually think about, if we move forward with this and if it is successful, are there different places that we can take this game? And then that factors into our decision of whether we should move forward with that game at all as well. Because if we create something that's successful, we want to be able to leverage that down the track. So the easy way to kind of double down on success is to take an existing game to new places. Accessing a new store, if you're launching on iOS, then the obvious next move is going to Google Play. But there are a lot of other stores and a lot of other platforms out there that can offer you incremental revenues for relatively little effort. In terms of what we try to do when we've had a successful game, we try to target platforms that have the biggest market, and that may not necessarily mean the biggest number of consumers, but potentially the biggest revenue. One thing to be really careful about, though, is when you move from one platform to another, if you're crossing kind of interface boundaries, moving from something like mobile to Facebook or mobile to desktop, you do need to be very sensitive that touch controls are very difficult potentially to refactor into controller or keyboard and mouse controls. And also, if you're moving from a portrait mobile aspect ratio into a landscape aspect ratio, like for Apple TV or the desktop, those can be very, very expensive undertakings. So you need to be careful that you factor that into your decision around porting. One of the things you need to be careful about as well when you're porting to new stores or new platforms is seeing whether your game or the store itself in their agreement requires you to maintain content or feature parity. Because if you need to keep all versions of the game up to date in order for them to talk to each other or whatever it might be, or because there's a legal requirement, that can get very expensive if you need to keep updating a game on a platform where you're not making much money. So it's something to think about there. To give you a practical example about how we've done this, one of our games that we released in December of 2012 was Into the Dead. Very successful for us, where we released first on iOS, and then it was March or April the following year in 2013 that we released on Google Play, and instantly we're doubling our revenues. Since then, we've gone to release on a number of different platforms, Amazon, the Windows Phone, Facebook, Oculus Rift, Gear VR. We actually have more platforms for the game in the works right now. In terms of where we're at, we've created much more revenue potential than had we just stayed on iOS. Creating a sequel is another kind of obvious example on where to go, but there's some caveats there as well, because there's a lot of sequels that get released on the App Store that don't live up anywhere near to the success of the first game. And I think the key there when you're trying to make a sequel is you need to come to the table with so much more than what that original game has, because you just don't want to offer more levels or slightly updated graphics or whatever it might be. That's something you can do within the initial game as an update through your live ops. So you want to do something that's not possible through those regular updates. You want to bring whole new features, whole new different ways of playing with that IP, and really create something new, which is of course inspired by the original game, but is not just more of the same. Platforms, Apple, Google, Amazon, are very likely to get behind a sequel product if that first game was very successful. So you can expect a lot more featuring around launch, which again is a good reason to be doing this if you do it right. And one of the things you can do, of course, is that if you have that successful game that has that active audience, then when you release that sequel, you can cross-promote very effectively and move that audience from that initial game into the sequel to get a lot of momentum. But you need to be very careful to think about that the revenues from that initial game will go down as that audience shifts across. So we haven't done it yet, and I don't know that we have released any true sequels on the App Store yet, but one of the things that's in development for us now is Into the Dead 2. This is bringing, as I said, much more to the table in terms of narrative, in terms of weapon upgrade systems, much more variance in gameplay and environments, all sorts of things. So, we're really excited that this will be, a great leap over where that initial game was. Something else you can do is create a derivative game. So if you have a successful formula, looking at different ways that you can kind of reskin or reshape that game to take advantage of different markets that can complement that original game or find new audiences. So you can look for new themes or new consumer interests. In our case, we do a lot of sports games, so taking a successful formula from one sports game to another. And the great thing about this sort of move is not only can you cross-promote pretty well between games, but there's also the opportunity for less cannibalization, because if you've got somebody that's a really big sports game fan, for example, you can actually have them playing both games at the same time, which is obviously going to amplify the value of your portfolio. So to use an example there, I mentioned Flick Kick Football Legends before, which was a very successful title from us from a revenue perspective. But when we went, we looked at a range of different sports and actually saw that if we targeted basketball, we could capture more of the North American market and much more lucrative markets than what we were seeing kind of across the board, which is a much more diverse range for soccer. So when we moved from Football Legends to Rival Stars basketball, we were actually able to capture a market which saw twice the ARPDAU. And when we then went last year in November to release Rival Stars College Football, we actually saw an 8 times improvement on ARPDAU over what that original Flick Kick Football Legends game was, carrying through those same ideas, the same kind of meta structure, and making subtle improvements along the way, but honing in on those much more lucrative markets. One of the other things you can do is actually, I've been talking about success, but iterate on failure as well. And there are some games that almost there. You know, they have a lot that's right about them, but one thing has kind of let them down. And potentially one thing that lets them down is not something you can fix easily in an update. It needs something bigger refactored. But there are ways and opportunities to take something that almost works and then turn that into a winning game. But when you're trying to do that, you need to make sure that you fix the problem, but you don't actually undermine what made all those other KPIs strong as well. So to give another set of examples here, we released a game about 18 months ago, Tap It Big Casino Empire, which was developed by Fuzzy Cube out of the US. And that had great KPIs, but being casino themed made it very difficult for us to get featured on the different stores. We had issues with ratings in some countries where they said we're a gambling game, even though there's no gambling in it. We really failed to get the kinds of downloads that we wanted to generate, even though it had really high retention and a really good ARPDAU. So we only saw like a 5-figure return on that, which is obviously not great. But we saw the opportunity there to double down on what was successful about that product. Fuzzy Cube went on to reskin that game, and in March we released Diner Dynasty, which was a much more marketable sort of product. That instantly then moved us to a 6-figure return, and then ourselves, we actually licensed the engine off of the developer and created our own version, Doomsday Clicker, which generated a 7-figure return. We've just released another version of the same game concept last week, Dungeon Inc. So the jury is still out on where we'll go from here, but we are seeing improved ARPDAU again as we've taken that opportunity to fix a few things and move forward. So we created great success kind of from a place that didn't start off quite as well as we thought it might. Very quickly, as we're running out of time, so a few things you can do to make this easier. Using a very flexible technology like Unity allows you to move between platforms really easily, develop fast. You can seek incentives from the different platforms like featuring cash incentives or favorable revenue splits, so renegotiating deals if they're hungry for a game, and a lot of the smaller stores and platforms are hungry for content. You can partner with brands, licensors, and publishers to fund and promote reskins, and also work, if you don't have the capacity, farm porting out and reskin work to third parties for revenue share deals. And there are companies like the Field Runner guys who did this early on to get that game across a wide series of platforms. One example of this, where we did a branded reskin, was moving from our Slam Dunk King to the Oreo game, and that created 3 times as much revenue for us in creating that product. So to summarize, here we go. So think about that even before you're starting games. Look at the potential for porting, reskinning, reworking, or creating sequels into your greenlight and investment decisions. So if you have something for successful, you can really double down on that. Look at porting to new stores and new platforms to access new customers cheaply. Consider a sequel if you can bring a lot of new things to the table that you can't do in just updating the game itself. Build complementary games to amplify that portfolio effect and build your portfolio, cross-promote those customers, and also rescue good games if they have a single flaw by trying again with fixing that problem. Make it easier to do through technology, incentives, and partnerships. That's it. Thank you.
Wow, that's a lot of content. Surely someone must have some questions to elucidate this stuff.
So you have 85 developers, 75, 85 developers?
Yes.
How many projects would you run concurrently?
Well, we have a team of 85. About 60 of those people are production people, developers. So I think in terms of new games that we're building, we're typically building about 3 new games. And then we have about 3 games that will be heavily supporting with live ops, and then we have another kind of team that kind of bounces around maintenance on other games as well. So there's quite a lot that we do, I think, for a relatively small team. But we have great people, so I'm really privileged.
Do you get any sort of like fan reactions where I'm seeing this same type of gameplay in just different permutations? Do you get any sort of negative feedback, or and it doesn't seem like it's also affected your revenue? So, like, at what point do you hit the diminishing returns on that?
I think you need to be very careful when you look at the feedback that you get on the stores and reviews, because it's very polarizing, because people usually are only commenting if they really like something or they really hate something. So you do have to put it in context. We haven't seen too much of that. We got that a little bit with going from Casino Empire to Dino Dynasty, because that was just a raw reskin. That was pretty much just an art and a text swap. Whereas moving to Doomsday Clicker was a little bit more involved, and there's whole new mechanics that we've added to Dungeon Inc. as well. I do think you need to be careful about that if you're trying to target the same customer by kind of putting a new dress on something and selling it as something new. But if you're going to a different market with something that's dressed up in a different way, then it's not so bad. So it hasn't been too much of a problem for us, honestly.
Thank you so much, Mario.
Thank you.